Hi, this is Pat McDonald, your host for Vote for Vermont, where our tagline is listening beyond the soundbites. Ben Kinsley is joining me as co-host. Hello, Ben, from far away.
Thank you.
And our guests tonight are Asher Crispe, who is the director of Vermont Future Now and Technology Futurist Consultant. He's got quite the resume. Also joining us is Brad Ferland. He's a lifelong Vermonter, a marketing consultant dealing with challenging political issues and solutions, which we certainly have these days. He's a Vermont writer, and he and his daughter raise sheep, and you should check his website out. They've got the cutest pictures. Also joining us, David Kelly, Esquire. He's an attorney who has practiced law in the Northeast Kingdom for 30 years. He's the former chair of the Hazen Union School Board and lead counsel in Athens versus State Board of Ed, the appeal to the Supreme Court of forced mergers under Act 46. So welcome all. Tonight we have a show that we're going to approach in 3 sections. Hope we get through them all. Act 46, school choice, and talking about rural areas in Vermont and how we can impact economic development. I must say this, I've gotten several input from people that wanted to talk about Act 46. I was talking to somebody in town the other day, and she says, when is somebody going to put a bill in to abolish Act 46? I said, well, I've got experts on the show. I will ask them if that's a possibility. But anyway, is there anything else you all would like to add to your introduction? I know, David, how long have you been a coach, a debate coach? Because that's pretty cool.
Well, I've coached high school debate for about 20 years.
Right. So I think I attended some debates in the State House one time. That was really interesting.
Well, you know, one of the things that is particularly interesting is that my debaters have gone on to do interesting things. One of them, the year before Ruth Bader Ginsburg died, was clerking for Ruth Bader Ginsburg. And
Whoa.
One of them now is on the UVM debate team. And he's working with helping to coach university students in Palestine to join world debate. And I think that's especially interesting. In fact, on Wednesday, we are going to record coaching videos for Palestinian students.
Oh, how excellent. I see a show in that, David. So we'll be in touch. Asher, could you tell us just a little bit about your organization, Vermont Future Now?
Sure. Yeah. So we engage people all over the state in all 14 counties on basically 5 key topics. Since my background is as a technology futurist, I try to address, from a Vermont perspective, the future of jobs, future of healthcare, future of education, future of energy, and future of government. And so we look at all kinds of innovative solutions and create idea generation, hopefully stimulate some collaborative possibilities all over the state.
That's great. You've certainly touched on all the key issues. So let's just jump right in here. I mentioned David was the lead in the Athens case, and that was a case that was joined by 30 school board members, correct? Or 30 school boards, right, David? Could you talk about the Supreme Court results of the Athens case? And may I say publicly, I never was so impressed watching you present your case to the Supreme Court. It was awesome. So I know it didn't end the way you had hoped, but I think everybody appreciated all the work that you did and put into that.
Well, it was actually 33 school districts.
Oh, 33.
That brought the appeal. And the truth of the matter is I was fortunate enough to work with some of the finest lawyers I've ever known in my life. That case was complicated. It involved a lot of pretty heavy lifting, and without the help of other attorneys, I could never have done it. I do think we did a good job. You know, former Supreme Court Justice Robert Jackson once said that the Supreme Court isn't because it's right because it's final. And the courts make mistakes. Probably one of the most egregious mistakes was Dred Scott versus Ohio, but that was one of only 100. And I think the two in the minority who voted with us on the appeal, I think they were right. I think the three in the majority, I think, my opinion, obviously I'm biased, but I think they got it wrong. And when you read the decision, the majority actually even misquotes the law in important ways. For example, the majority said Section 5 of the Act would allow districts to remain unmerged only if they met certain requirements. That's not what Section 5 said at all. It said that they could remain unmerged, particularly if they had certain characteristics. So it was a decision that was disappointing. One justice has made a huge difference in Vermont history. But it's interesting how it's playing out now, because you see so many of the districts trying to dissolve these forced mergers, which is what we predicted would happen.
Well, wasn't Maine doing that too, and it turned into such a mess? They tried to back out, and maybe they're still doing it. I don't know.
Yeah, I think, Maine was 10 years ahead of us, as were quite a few other states, and we should have learned from West Virginia, Nebraska, North Dakota, Maine, the other states that did this, and the consequences. And what happened in Maine, especially in the rural areas where it didn't make any sense, is they began getting divorced from some of these shotgun marriages.
Not good. Well, I just, before I turn it over to Ben, I don't know who the attorney was from the state, but you just nailed it. And I don't think he presented anything strong and compelling, but obviously the court thought so.
Well,
but thank you. All right, Ben, take it away.
Yeah, I think I'd like to explore that question of unwinding some of these Act 46 mergers a little bit more. I'm curious, David, what you think how many districts we think may try to unwind themselves, and also what we can expect to come out of that, given what we know from the Maine experience.
Well, it's interesting because we do have a divorce law for merged districts that preceded Act 46. And there will be some discussion in the upcoming legislature about that. I think the State Board of Education is probably not happy with that. But what we've seen in districts down south, Reedsboro and Halifax, further up, Newbury, Bradford, in the Middlebury area, Ripton, Cornwall, Weybridge, Shoreham, and in other areas of the state, quite a few districts seeking to dissolve these. Some went into these marriages voluntarily, and nevertheless have discovered that there are no savings, and what there is a likelihood of very strong, very critical small rural community elementary schools being closed. Moortown, Fayston is another example, in closer to in Washington County. So around the state, the consequences of these forced mergers are being felt, and the results were predictable.
Are they allowed to get a divorce? Will the board allow them to do that?
Well, it's really, that's a complicated question, because there are two sections in Title 16, the education statutes, that do allow union districts to dissolve and unified union districts to dissolve. They're both slightly different, and it becomes complicated because we have districts that voluntarily merge, that voted to merge, that are trying to dissolve. We have unified union districts that were forced to merge that are trying to dissolve. We have union districts that are trying to dissolve. And the law is slightly different in each case. And how that plays out is really hard to predict. But I think it's to the credit of those towns that say, look, the law says we can dissolve, we're going to dissolve. And the legislature can deal with it. There are a number of people who ran for office in this last election who came out and just said we would support a bill that said no small elementary school can be closed without the consent of the community where it's located. I've usually been a Republican in much of my life, but I supported Molly Gray this year because as a candidate for lieutenant governor, she was really clear. She went to school in Newberry. She went to high school at Oxbow, and she was fierce in her defense of small rural community elementary schools.
Right. Good for you. I do agree with that. I was reading, my other comment was that bill was never, that Act 46, I don't see anything there about cost savings. I have read that thing, and that's not the intention of Act 46. I mean, they played it up as that, but when you read it, there is no cost savings in there, is there?
No, they pulled it out.
As we all laugh.
Drafting the bill. It was originally part of the discussion because that's how they sold the House on it.
Yes.
And they pulled it out of the final draft of the bill. The Senate pulled it out.
Yeah, it's a joke. And they kept saying how it was going to save money.
Well, they still included efficiency as one of the goals, but the fact of the matter is, if you look at what's happened in these merged districts, I don't know of a single one that is showing tax savings. In fact, my understanding is that after the merger of Bradford and Newberry into the district with Oxbow, the superintendent, this was supposed to be creating greater efficiencies, especially at the administrative level. My understanding is that the superintendent in that district has added 10 new personnel.
Wow.
Now, I don't have that fact in front of me. That's what I've been told. It needs to be researched. But if that's the case, and what happens is predictable. Again, you don't have local boards. You don't have the same oversight. You don't have the same transparency. You have boards that are removed from the community that become much more dependent on the superintendent. And even the superintendents are removed from the schools. You do have really rare and unique leadership in places like North Country Union with John Castle, who really decentralizes authority and depends on his principles. But when you have these merged boards, you have a disconnect. You don't have the same transparency and you don't have the same oversight. It's predictable that you would have growing budgets and growing personnel at the administrative level.
And we see that in the statewide numbers too. If you look at the education spending statewide that the legislature has approved, that's been going up throughout the whole merger of Act 46, the whole process. But the largest increase was the first full operating year after the mergers took place. Like you look at that increase, and that was the most significant one. And now it's going to be the next couple of years is going to be difficult to tell what spending is being driven by mergers and what spending is being driven by COVID. That's going to be a separate issue, but that will be interesting as well.
Yeah, I think didn't the major problem came when they were looking at preferred structure versus alternative structures, where towns work so hard, as did we in my area, work so hard to present an alternative structure, and the Board of Education just said no, you have to merge, and the legislature was told that schools had the option to present an alternative structure as long as it met the requirements of a merger. And I think that's what people were just obsessed about and just so angry over.
Yeah, Franklin, we were up in Franklin, Vermont, where they have a elementary school with high academic performance and low cost. And they worked hard as a community to present, a 100-page document. And they were feeling pretty sure that the document was either not read or just ignored.
Right.
And that was really part of the problem that was happening in other communities as well.
Yeah. The legislature, I think, might have had a different look or a take on this bill had they understood what would really happen when
Well,
the
you know,
alternative
it's really
structures were
interesting.
submitted.
After all of our paperwork was filed with the court, David Sharp, who was the chairman of the House Education Committee when this whole thing was going through, and who was probably its most zealous salesperson, he wrote an article for the Addison Independent, and he wrote, "Now, several years into implementing the plan in Addison County, we have not seen the promised reduction in administrative staff in school buildings or in superintendent's offices. What we are seeing instead are proposals to close community schools against the specific intent of the legislation and the wisdom of many community members." Now, that was the man who was banging the drum the most loudly, who wouldn't listen when we came in time and time again to testify and to say, hey, this is what's going to happen. Finally, after all is said and done and the bleeding is over, he writes an article to the Addison Independent and says, oops,
Lovely.
we made a mistake.
Yeah,
Yeah, I
yes,
remember
we
having
did.
a conversation with David Sharp many times about what this was actually going to do versus what they were intending for it to do. And it was very clear from looking at Maine and other states how, good intentions turn into, pretty substantial consequences for some of these local school districts who are going to end up losing their schools.
So, David, I have a question from a viewer, and I'll bet you'll know, because this is a question I would not come up with. What is the difference between the Dillon Rule and Home Rule as legal foundations for local government? What if Vermonters mobilized and the legislature passed Home Rule?
Well, anybody who thinks that's going to happen has been smoking something that I guess is now legal.
It's legal now, it's okay.
But the idea that the Vermont legislature and the people we send to Montpelier are going to give up control over municipal government, I don't think is realistic. It's really hard to get people to give up power. Right. And I think it would be a great thing. I would be 100% supportive of moving more towards Home Rule and further away from Dillon's Rule. I think we would have better government in Vermont, but I don't think that's likely. I mean, if you know of some legislators that are saying, I would rather that we don't have so much oversight, and I would rather devolve. I mean, Vermont has moved just in the opposite direction.
For sure.
I mean, the whole notion of local control in education has pretty much been eroding constantly over the years.
Well, we have very little authority in town meeting of what we can vote on and what we can't. It's almost all, it's just predetermined by the time the budget gets to us.
But if we're going to have a revolution, that would be worth fighting for. I would be supportive of it.
Cool. That sounds exciting. A revolution. So better hurry up. I'm getting older every day. So could somebody, and all of you, just summarize where we are right now with Act 46 and what might be coming up to fix this thing? If I hope they think it's broken, but I do. Where are we right now?
Well, the best thing we could do would be to pass a law that said no, in particular, no elementary school can be closed without the consent of the community where it's located. That kind of bill, I think, would go a long way to fixing the problems.
Do you know where that back noise is coming from? Somebody should put their mute on.
Oh, I think that's from our kitchen. I think somebody.
Well, you're talking, so.
All good.
All right, that's good.
So
we're home.
David, do you think that's probably the best that we can hope for in this coming legislative session, in the 2021 legislative session, is for them to basically, not necessarily pass something that reverses or starts to reverse Act 46 and Act 49, but really just prevents elementary schools from closing? Is probably the best that we can hope for?
I think that's the best we can hope for, but I also think that there's some worst that you could expect. I think there's leadership from Chittenden County, Phil Baruth, Kate Webb, that have had big voices in educational policy that haven't got a clue about the importance of small rural elementary schools. And I think there'll be some effort to stop these districts from withdrawing from merged boards or even dissolving merged boards. I think that kind of legislation is particularly that would be particularly onerous, but I think it's a possibility.
That could start the revolution if they try to stop the divorce.
Yeah,
That'd be interesting.
At least with the Senate and Phil Baruth, there's going to be a little bit of a check there with an incoming lieutenant governor and an incoming Senate pro tem that are from rural parts of the state.
Exactly, and that could make a big difference.
Yeah.
It's interesting where the fault lines are drawn in Vermont, not so much along party lines as they are between rural and urban.
Yeah, that was a very stark difference on Act 46. Looking at who voted for and against it, it was definitely not a party line vote. It was a rural-urban vote in
Interesting
votes.
Well, listen, gentlemen, I'd like to move on to school choice and bring in Brad and Asher on this. Does somebody want to volunteer to give us a history of school choice in Vermont since we were the first?
Yeah.
Brad, you want to do that?
Well,
Asher?
I think it started back in 1869 in Vermont. There were one-room schoolhouses dotting all across the state. Communities were sending kids to various schools. It evolved until, probably the 60s or 70s when they started doing some more consolidation for same thing as Act 46 for economic reasons. And then Act 46 comes along and, starts closing even more small schools and trying to consolidate communities into larger districts and the like. What we've seen, we've been traveling around the state. There's been this notion that, if you have school choice, you're going to harm public education. And I don't buy into that for one. I think that we're seeing, we've been to Thaddeus Stevens, for instance, or Compass School. We see these kids who have gotten really a new lease on life. Things weren't working where they were. And I've seen not some testimony on this, I've seen hundreds of kids testimony and crying and saying, my life was a disaster, and for a plethora of reasons. And we were able to change. We were able to go to school of our choice. Our parents make it work. The neighbors make it work. We transport. We do what we have to do. That kind of thing.
Great.
And it's even, to me, it's even more important now that the school choice aspect and keeping the small school. I think the legislature got it backwards. I think that they thought that a small school that didn't have a lot of students couldn't function. And that's a misnomer. Small schools, there's the Elmore School is a one-room schoolhouse with, 22 kids, a teacher and a teacher aide. It functions beautifully. And it's the heartbeat and vibrance of that little community. And if people, the legislators do say, oh, we can't attract people to Vermont, we're losing our young people, on and on and on. Well, a lot of the families that I talked to that were in the choice communities, they moved from out of state to choice communities in Vermont, and they located there because they would have options for their children for good education. And they brought, an intellectual property to the community. They brought jobs, they functioned in jobs either in the community or remotely. And they're not going to be doing this kind of, they're not going to be attracted to these small communities if they're bringing children in and they have to have their kid bused for an hour, away, or don't have the choice of giving them some options that they want. So we've got a great history. We're just not You know, this would be an opportunity in my mind. I hear what David's saying. We're fearing the worst, but the independent school enrollment is going through the roof. The religious schools in Vermont are at capacity right now. They are doing everything they can, and their kids are in school 5 days a week, versus the hybrid model, which is causing teachers heartache and headache that is absolutely unbelievable.
Yep.
So and then, go on to one other thing on getting back to the Act 46 thing. In today's Messenger, and you've probably seen it in other papers, tax department projects 9% increase in education and property tax. Now, we got to look at the consequences of the action. We fought against Act 46 for several years, and it was this steam train going down the track where legislators would not budge. There was an arrogance about it. They just wouldn't budge. And now, when we're looking at the caboose in the distance, we've got all these little communities that are saying, whoa, this isn't working for us. Even ones who, as David said, even ones who had merged voluntarily, they're suddenly finding that it's not working. So you got to do an audible. The greatest thing the legislature could do right now is an audible, and forget about the traditional politics and try to fix these things in a constructive manner.
That's good. Now, how many schools are tuitioning schools? I have down 71, but I don't know if that's true or not true. Is that a good number?
It's more like 90.
Oh, really? Well,
There are
that's
about
looking
90
some old. That's great.
And you know what's interesting? Those districts are districts like Walden, Wolcott, Stannard. Those are some of the poorest communities in the state of Vermont. And they are absolute, they would be determined not to give it up. The suggestion choice somehow only helps the affluent. It's silly. Those communities are not affluent communities. Those are communities where students from some of the poorest families in the state have remarkable choices. And I was the chair of a school board that embraced some of those choice communities, like Walden and Wolcott. We had to compete. It made us a little bit better because we wanted those students to bring their tuition dollars to our school. It was good for everybody.
Well, and you see those kids that from Stannard and from, all these small towns that, there's no way that individually those towns could provide world-class education, at least the options that are available in schools like St. Johnsbury Academy. And that opens up a whole new world that, parents that never in a million years could dream of sending their kids to a school like St. Johnsbury Academy or Sharon Academy or any of these other schools. Suddenly, that's
the AFS foreign exchange students.
Yeah. Yes,
or
right.
To go to an art school in California. The opportunities are enormous. And one of the things that we have done right in Vermont is passing Act 77 and moving towards dual enrollment and early college. And what we need to do is take Act 77 and expand it. If we can't move to school choice and for every student, at least make tuitioning portable for juniors and seniors, maybe even sophomores.
I just met a young man. I interviewed him for another show with another topic, and he was from this area, and he went down, did the school choice approach, and we started to talk about it, and he did exactly what Brad was talking about, thrilled to death, blossomed, loved it. His teacher joined us, and they said they've got quite a few kids that are down there on school choice, and they're much happier and productive. And I mean, how can you fight that? That's great. I don't know how they pick them, though, and that was one of the questions. I mean, how do parents, first of all, they see their child is struggling, but how do they know which school is the best for the child? Because maybe you're going from one bad situation to another, but I've never heard that they made a mistake. I don't know how they pick those schools.
Let me tell you quickly about two students who came to my office. One was a young student who wanted to study drafting. Lake Region didn't offer it. Linden Institute did. He wanted to go to Linden Institute. The school board wouldn't let him leave. But it was simple. He wanted to study drafting and he couldn't, and he was never able to. I had another student come to my office who was Black. She was going to a school where she was being called names like Zebra and Oreo. Her parents were mixed race. She wanted to get out. The school board wouldn't let her go. Her parents had to dig into not very deep pockets to come up with the money to tuition her to another school.
Wow. Why wouldn't they let them go? They weren't just receiving tuition schools, or why did they say no?
It was Harwood High School, and they wanted her money.
Oh, right. It's always
They
about
wanted
money.
the tuition dollars that came with the student.
Right.
And by the way, this is an interesting point. Technically, Vermont has a level of universal school choice now, and we don't talk about that very often. Yeah. And it's because there's a bunch of reasons why, but any high school in the state can send a student to another high school, and that is in place now. That is part of the school tuitioning program. It's part of the financing for tuitioning. But the catch is that both the sending and receiving school have to agree. And this is of those cases where all the incentives are for the sending school, which are the two cases Dave's talking about where they got blocked. Right. The incentive for the sending school is to not let them go because that's $20,000 out the door if they do.
These cases came up before we had public school choice in Vermont. I think something else that's important is we also have a law in Vermont that allows the school board on its own initiative to let students take their tuition to any accredited school. Most school boards don't have the courage to do it, but a student who wants to do something out of the ordinary can go to the school board and they can allow the tuition to be taken. We did that at Hazen, and it created quite a stir with some of the old guard.
But I would think if your two students have such compelling reasons why they want to go, there must be a way to appeal it or to have somebody, as you said, the school board, make a decision. That's the right choice for both of those young people, especially the girl who is being harassed. I mean, that's just wrong.
Well,
something should happen.
Kind of along these same lines, what about kids who have special needs? What options are available to them, and what benefits does the provide to those types of students?
If their parents are strong advocates and have good skills, advocacy skills, I think there's a lot that is available. But you have to negotiate. You have to negotiate the system.
That is what I had when I worked in the Department of Ed as the deputy. We had quite a few parents, and they knew they were, and I really admired them because they just worked to get the best thing for their child, and they wouldn't stop until they got it. And I give them credit because they were right, and what they were requesting was just all about money, and that's the deal. But I thought the special ed, I thought there was a thing last year or the year before last about requiring all schools, mandate all schools to be responsive to kids with special needs, and they were talking about how expensive it was for some of these schools. What happened with all of that discussion?
I think that on that, I think the threat of that, and independent schools were very nervous about that, but I don't think it came with
Oh, nothing happened? Because that was the talk of the legislature for quite a while, and in the papers about demanding that these schools spend money when they didn't even have a student that needed special needs. I think some schools, if you have a student, they would meet that individual's need, but not prepare the whole school for any need unless they were requested by a student who needed it.
Yeah, and part of that was that they were basically asking independent schools to do something to have a higher level of standards than even our public schools do. Yeah. That was a large part of the concern. Of course, part of it was small schools that were going to have to comply with this and the cost of complying, but it was also, why are we asking independent schools to do something we're not even asking public schools to do? Which is a great segue into one other question that I'm sure our viewers want to know, which is, what kind of regulatory requirements do independent schools have to go through, and how do they compare to public schools?
Good question. Hello?
They have to be, they are accredited, and one of the things that I see that's different with the independent schools is, and the religious schools as well, is they can make modifications to curriculum sort of on the go, meaning they can be more timely to modern day happenings. One of the things, we see, and as was seen up at Thaddeus Stevens, is they could really adjust to things quickly. But they're required to have a performance like the public schools. It's not a free-for-all by any means.
Yeah, listen, I'm sorry if we want some last comments, but I would like to move on to economic development to give equal time to mostly to Brad and Asher, I guess. Tell us about your travels around the state and your focus on rural Vermont and what you've seen and what the people have told you, other than help.
So I'm actually very bullish about rural Vermont. I think that we are engaged right now in a colossal shift of what might be referred to as geographic arbitrage, that we are undervaluing a lot of rural settings. We are undervaluing the labor pool that is there, the real estate that is there, and so on. And there are inflection points, technological inflection points, that are going to shift gears back towards rural in ways that weren't possible ever before. One of the things that most of our legislators seem to not have any awareness of, that always shocks me as a futurist, is the fact that there are already more than 800 Starlink satellites up in orbit and are functional. I'm already signed up for their beta test myself. And that basically means if the sky's over your head anywhere in rural Vermont, you're going to have service. When we spoke to legislators, they seemed to think that either this was a pipe dream for the future, that it was going to happen years and years from now, and it was only going to be servicing the big cities. Actually, they're not going to service the big cities. This network was designed for places like the Northeast Kingdom and Vermont. It's only targeting regional areas, and it's going to be the equivalent of having ultra high-speed fiber connection at a reasonable cost that will go to every household, and even vehicles traveling, on dirt roads or in the middle of the forest. So that changes the possibilities in quite a radical way economically when you can have something like that. That's number one. That I think is the good news. And that's weeks away, weeks to a few months away from being able to get involved in a beta test of that here in Vermont. It should be ubiquitous throughout the entirety of North America within a year to 18 months. But already people should be able to start signing up for that. The cost of doing this is much less than rolling out miles of fiber.
Oh, for sure.
Connection. So that also affords us possibilities with education as well. And we'd like to see a reawakening of the micro school, which is what's so in fad in the Silicon Valley world, where you get tremendous amounts of creativity and innovation. And I think that's going to show a kind of entrepreneurship spirit in some of these rural communities, which will see that having a new future-oriented school, a micro school that's perhaps funded by new startup businesses that happen in those areas, that all those things will come together to stimulate growth. The other thing that's amazing is that we live in a time where change is moving so rapid that no longer is the college degree of the same value of what it was before. Almost everyone needs what's called upskilling. We need to spend a lifetime of learning in order to remain competitive. And so the new models are to have little nano degrees, short bursts of learning that are usually targeted to whatever job you want to do. And often employers are paying for that. And having better connectivity is going to allow people to get access to that at any age, in any time frame they want. So it has a democratizing effect. It's very mutable. It's very empowering. And I think that's also going to supercharge communities.
And Asher, I know that the legislature over the last year or two, I got the sense that they wanted everybody to move to the city, to move, and they were proposing some legislation that would almost force the dynamics of moving to downtown. And I sure hope you're right, because that's not what Vermont is all about. I don't want to live in the up top of a store or something, or downtown so I could walk. I want to live where I live, surrounded by trees.
Right. Well, I'm surrounded by 86,000 acres of protected forest here in Danby, Vermont. And I work with people all over the world. Right from my house, I have a home office. Today, it's increasingly common for people in the corporate world to have supply chains that are international, to work with colleagues all over the world. You don't need to be physically present in one area. The average footprint of a new startup is so small it'll fit in the average Vermont barn. So you don't need huge workforces to come to be involved in these things. And what's even better, and this is something that Brad and I are really actively working on, is trying to show rural communities how easy it is today. It's more easy than ever before in human history to attract capital investment into your startup ideas. If you want to be an entrepreneur, or if you have a small to mid-sized business and you want to grow it, never before has there been such an ease by which you can attract that capital. For one, and if you look at venture capital back in the 1970s, there was like $10 million available. Now it's in the trillions. So there's almost more money out there for investment than there are good investments to place, which is an amazing idea for opportunity. But there are also platforms like the Quodio platform, very familiar with the founder of that platform. And they've looked at the venture capital world. There's about 17,000 venture capital firms worldwide.
Wow.
And they've already onboarded several thousand of them. And you can literally fill out in a matter of minutes your profile for your company and what you want to do as either a startup or a growth play with your company, and they'll play matchmaker. So it's sort of like speed dating between an entrepreneur and an investor. And instead of going around and knocking on doors and trying to find someone who's going to fund your venture, you can have it in front of literally thousands, and actually uses artificial intelligence to try to figure out who's most likely to want to match with you to give you money to start your business, grow your business, et cetera. So there are these tools that have never existed before in human history, and we have just as much access to them in the most rural parts of Vermont as in Silicon Valley or downtown New York.
Right.
So you bring up a few really good points, Asher. First, Starlink, which is, for people that aren't familiar with it, is a satellite-based internet service. Similar, if not faster speeds than 5G, which is also coming to Vermont. But again, cell coverage is what it is. And then, of course, there's also this a large investment from the federal government that is being directed into broadband build out as well. Hopefully, a lot of that goes to improving existing broadband infrastructure where it's subpar, as well as potentially reaching, maybe not necessarily last mile, because you can fill in a little bit last mile with 5G and with satellite internet services. But that's interesting. But it's also interesting seeing, like you said, the investment opportunities, companies that have the ability to get off the ground in small rural areas now. There's a lot more access to capital as well as resources. And I say capital meaning both monetary capital, but also intellectual capital is much more accessible than it ever has been. There's another piece that I think is interesting here, and this is why high-speed internet access is so critical in rural areas, is we're seeing this massive shift in the U.S. workforce, where large companies are realizing that they can have a significant portion of their workforce that's working remotely, and they can operate that way indefinitely. Amazon, Microsoft, Salesforce, Twitter, all of these companies that are huge companies that have realized that their workforce can be anywhere. They don't have to be in a major city. They could be in Vermont. They could be in New York. They could be in or upstate New York. They could be in New Hampshire. They could be anywhere that those people want to be. And in large numbers, they're moving to rural areas. I've seen some towns in Vermont, even rural parts of the state, that are reporting that their population has doubled, if not tripled, over the last year because of this phenomenon. And it offers an opportunity for Vermont to showcase what we can do, the lifestyle that we offer. And, we're not going to keep all of them, but we have a potential to keep some of those people here if we sell it right.
How much do you think COVID, this could be to Brad and Asher and anybody, COVID is going to really, just what Ben said, it's going to change a lot. My daughter's company, she's home and she wants to stay home. It's not one of the big ones like you were talking about, but I think we're going to see a big change because of COVID. What do you guys think?
I'm not so sure on the long term you're going to see that, because if you look into the social and emotional intelligence component of office life, there's something from the face-to-face encounter, sometimes referred to as the village effect, that you can't get working remotely.
Right.
So there, you actually see somewhat of a decline in productivity when people are away from one another. And there are these serendipitous collisions that occur at work, where people sort of stimulate each other with ideas, even if they're in different departments or fields. Yeah. So it's important to have something like that going on too. At the same time, we have a underutilized wealth of individuals, many retired here in the state, that are present and former entrepreneurs, former CEOs of companies, investors, and so on. And if we can harness that collective body of wisdom and create a mentorship program, which is something we're very much looking into, going all the way down to the high school level and then up, I think we can coach people into situations where, even if they're working remote from home, they can have like sort of these little collaborative hubs where they get their fix of social interaction, even in little small communities. And of course, some of the tipping points that are achieved by having ultra high-speed connectivity via satellite is it allows us to source materials and reduce costs of transportation and delivery, because the driverless vehicles that are already operating in metropolitan areas, including for delivery, will be able to come here too. So you're going to have all kinds of things being able to show up at your doorstep for a fraction of the cost, which again, favors rural economies.
So when you both have been going out to the rural areas and talking to people, what's their response? Are they excited about it? Because you're clearly excited about this.
Yeah.
And I'm sure it's catching. Do they understand what opportunities are out there for them?
Well, they're hungry for them. We've presented this idea, as Asher said, to like 5 parts of Vermont, and the enthusiasm is just, we talked to one person in the community and they suddenly have lined up the economic development person, the finance person, all of these people to get into a meeting to start discussing the idea. Even Dave Kelly's got this whole network in his market area that would be hungry for this thing. And I want to sort of spring off of something Asher said is, and Ben too, if we bring people into Vermont, we bring them into, the rural areas in some cases have more affordable housing, certainly than Burlington does. A startup house could be something that's affordable, but we're also looking at connecting the dots. Our travels have been looking at a bigger picture. You've got to have the school, because the family wants to come in and they want their kids in a local school. you can say, hey, what are we going to do tonight, dear? We can go out in the yard in rural Vermont and look at the stars. But if there's a pub and brewery that does barbecue and has a band once a week, and there's a general store where we get to go in and get our groceries and they know our name, and there's, you know, something else, and then the school functions, and then our kids sing in a choir, and then there's community picnics and that type of thing, then all of a sudden you've got something that used to exist in Vermont. It's maybe a different technology. Maybe it was maple sugaring back then, and now it's bourbon making. But it's all part of the attractor. And so that, you know, if we had a message for the legislators to look at this bigger picture of how do you attract, and I saw it even in St. Albans, in both our hospital and in our downtown. The hospital decades ago suddenly started building their infrastructure rather than trying to attract physicians. They made the hospital look good. Downtown St. Albans, if you've been to it in the last year, you'll see that it's gone through this metamorphosis of infrastructure change to make it look good. So there's all these food eating places, and people want to come now. And they'll do the same thing in rural Vermont. I always use the simple example of Elmore, the school, the park, and this wonderful little country store. But those things are the heartbeat. And if people don't have those things, they're just not going to have, you know, they're not going to be attracted. And this is what, you know, with what Asher's saying, with some funding that allows this growth to happen, you know, we can really revitalize what's going on. Great.
I'm just curious, there's economic development corporations throughout Vermont, you know, sponsored by the state. Have you touched base with any of them? Because it sort of sounds like maybe they need a little.
Well, yeah, they do a great job, but they do. We're meeting with Tim Smith. He's Franklin County Industrial Development Corp. He's part of the mix in our Swanton, in that area. We're doing sort of and they're all excited about it. The Economic Development Corps often have dealt with the larger manufacturing business or whatever, and we're talking more what David Kelly's talking about, and you know, if it's a seed business, or if it's a restaurant, or if it's, you know, packing, you know, oats or something, whatever. There's all these opportunities in beautiful, beautiful Vermont settings.
That's great.
Yeah, I think this is, you know, we're seeing economic shift that, you know, we don't necessarily know what it's going to look like yet, I think, but we're seeing the movements of it. And in some cases, you know, this is a typical, you know, every 30, 40 years, we see this cycle of, you know, migration to and from cities. So we've seen that for the last century or so. And, you know, the last one was, you know, in the 1960s and 70s, when we saw this back to the land movement. And then over the early 2000s, you know, we saw this movement back into the cities. Cities were growing again. Rural parts of America were shrinking. And now, you know, in the span of a year, we've seen that flip-flop. And the question is how sustainable is that going to be? A long-term trend? Is that going to be a short-term trend? What is that going to look like? But one of the things that's interesting is that, you know, our economy has changed so much. It's moved so much towards a service economy and technology, and not necessarily manufacturing. Even, you know, there's still high-tech manufacturing in certain parts of the country, and biotech manufacturing, but, you know, not the type of manufacturing that that you think of when you think of, you know, the U.S. economy.
And Pat, Asher can maybe talk a little bit too about the venture capitalists. You may not be ready for prime time right away, but Asher, there's also sort of the mentoring part of that too, right?
Yeah, I think part of it is to help people understand what 21st century businesses are likely to look like. Manufacturing is actually a losing proposition even in China today, because everything is going to automation and robotics. Much of the manufacturing that Ben spoke to also is all being automated here in the United States.
Right.
And we fail to appreciate how much that is happening. But actually what that's pushing back is the point where you can have the resurgence of craft. You can start to think of future manufacturing as manufacturing a product for a market of one. A custom product, something done very boutique-y, small scale, like the artisan working in their barn, to forge something that's a unique item, a one of a kind, in an age where you can rapidly duplicate just about anything in the digital sphere. So that's something that people are having a thirst for, and the economics are tipping now such that you'll be able to go out to the entire planet. For the first time now, we have more than 60% of the human population on Earth is connected online. That's going to hit 100% by 2025, and the whole world's your marketplace for something that's very, very particular to you and your creative niche that you have. So that favors the blacksmith in Grafton, Vermont.
That's great. That's great.
Great example of that is craft beer industry, right?
That's our favorite topic.
Got to work that in somehow every show.
I think in Elmore they're building ovens to bake breads or something like that. And they're selling them all over the country.
No, that's great. So listen, I think we're sort of getting close to our end of our hour, and I'd like to give each of you a minute or two to make a final comment on actually any of the topics we've talked about, because it's been a great, great show. David, could I turn to you for a wrap up of whatever you want to say? Well, within the topics.
Well, I think that there are all kinds of interesting opportunities for rural Vermont. And it will take a great deal of energy and creativity to take advantage of them. But here in the Northeast Kingdom, we are seeing an emerging new agricultural economy, and it's not a day too early. We're dealing with a lot of poverty, challenges, and a lot of demographic problems. But there are incredible signs of hope with some of our new businesses, Jasper Hill Cheese, Pete's Greens, Hill Farmstead Brewery. And I think the agricultural and food industry have a great future when we consider things like this pandemic and its source and the importance of quality, healthy food. So I'm hopeful that our rural economy will prosper as a result of that. And I'm looking forward to talking to Asher about the potentials for investment.
That's great. Yeah, it drives me crazy when I hear 1 out of 4 Vermonters suffer with food insufficiency. I'm like, this is an agricultural state, and it's a really bad statistic. Anyway, thank you, David. I appreciate it. And Asher, do you want to go ahead?
Yeah, I'd just like to say something on education. I think that when we look at Act 46, we're probably not going to go back, but we can go forward. And what we really need is a complete revolution in education. And that is going on in certain parts of the world. The US has now fallen to 26th globally in education, despite spending an extraordinary amount. Now, Singapore is at the very top of that list. They spend 74% less than we do on education. They have the top outcomes. And part of that is because they've learned to create adequate signaling and feedback mechanisms in their entire process. For one, a teacher in the Singapore system is reviewed from all sources. And if a teacher gets a D grading 3 years in a row, they are banned for life from the teaching profession. So that's strong consumer signaling, right?
Really?
We've removed a lot of that in our process. We've removed consumer signaling back into the whole education sphere. So there's a lot we can do, and it can cost less. I think we can achieve better education for less money, and it can be available to everyone. So it can be very democratized. And I think we can do the same thing with healthcare and many other of the things that seem to be like intractable problems. It just requires like really going outside the box, thinking about them.
Well, you've got my vote. Thank you very much. Brad, could you take us home?
Sure. I think that it's, we're all living in a new world, and we're all conducting our lives in a new, different way. And I would advocate for the legislature to do the same thing, that business as usual is not going to be productive to the future of Vermont. If I hear one more legislator put on a brochure, we've got to, have economic development, and we've got to get jobs for our kids and stuff. Done with that. We have the opportunity right now to make these things work. And the private sector is hopefully going to do it without the consent of the legislature, or even the approval.
That's great.
I think that there's a world out there. The other thing I would strongly advocate along this education thing is school choice is an opportunity for the public school and the independent school and the religious school to all uplift and share their greatest strengths. And if we did that, and we're not in competition, we actually could have much better outcomes for what doesn't get talked about a whole lot is our kids.
Yeah.
And if there's that kind of sharing, then hallelujah.
Right. Working together, there's a concept. Thank you very much, Brett. Thank you all for joining us. Thank you, Ben, for co-hosting, and we'll see you all next week. And in the meantime, keep listening beyond the sound bites.